Finally back in my hometown. Yes, I've been walking back from Perivale all this time. I would have got here sooner, but Nick, the train enthusiast that he is, hoarded the damn thing all to himself. And I mean all to himself. There were a lot of disgruntled passengers. Well, while on the walk back, this little topic came into my head, and while I'm not the first person to discuss this by any means, as an animator, I think it's worth throwing my 2 cents out there, so strap in. So ever since the original release of The Power of the Daleks set the ball rolling back in 2016, there has been a glorious renaissance of animated Doctor Who projects, particularly those that serve to supplement the lost visual material of the 1960s serials. They've become so lucrative that even when their funding seemed threatened by bestie backers BBC America parting ways with the show in 2022, new funding was naturally sought out to resume progress on resurrecting the show's back catalogue for modern accessibility, even if the visual style chosen for certain projects isn't particularly appealing. On the whole, it's an endeavour that the Doctor Who fanbase is in overwhelming support of. That said, however, there are only so many serials affected by the archival junking practices that are left to be given this treatment, and that fact combined with a handful of others has led some fans to speculate. Once they're done animating, I don't know, whatever the missing story they choose to animate last is, what will they do after that? I mean, they might just stop. And that certainly is a possibility. Mission accomplished, all missing episodes animated, pack it up and go home, lads. But as I said, these projects are very lucrative. That's probably good incentive for them to keep it going and apply their skill set to other Doctor Who content. But what other content, I hear you ask? Well, short of junking more episodes to give themselves extra work, audio dramas, particularly those by Big Finish Productions? It's a possibility. Of course, Big Finish already have their little ecosystem of animated projects in their own right. As I touched on in my Animations of Who duology a couple of years back, both Real Time and the 2003 version of Shada starring Paul McGann received truncated and admittedly pretty limited animated webcasts courtesy of BBC I in the early 2000s. They did a 10-minute 3D animation centred around Bernie Summerfield in 2010, and numerous new releases of theirs over recent years have been accompanied by trailers brought to life in this same format. And don't even get me started on the countless unofficial fan-made projects bringing scenes or sometimes entire stories to life visually that you can find here on YouTube. Considered doing one myself, but honey, do I look like I want a cease and desist? So it's not like there isn't a precedent for bringing Big Finish into a visual medium like this, and given the existence of 2017 Shada and how it saw release before serials like Evil of the Daleks and Fury from the Deep, it shows that the BBC aren't shy to go beyond the little niche of missing episodes. So why not try animating Big Finish audio plays? Thing is though, there are certainly some irks with this whole idea. Audio drama can be quite a daunting or even alienating medium to get into, as, well, it's audio and audio alone. Elements of visual storytelling like camera movements, lighting and colour grading, facial expressions and hand gestures, makeup and prosthetics, costuming, etc. are absent, and some people simply find it difficult to engage with media without some form of visual stimuli. Now, on one hand, this may sound like a perfect excuse to create animations for audio dramas, as those people who feel left out of the party can finally find an entry point to these stories. But the issue there is that audio dramas are written to be listened to. They therefore tend to have a lot of overly descriptive dialogue to convey to the audience what a scene supposedly looks like, what kind of environments the characters are in, how other characters or creatures appear and what actions they're taking, and so on. This corridor seems to go on forever. What's that over there? Concrete bulkhead door. From the sounds of the acoustics, seems to be 10 feet thick? No way am I getting through that. And otherwise, this seems to be a dead end. Can't see anything else around here. Gotta backtrack and find another way through. It serves a purpose. It helps to paint a picture in your mind's eye. But the second you add visuals to that kind of dialogue, it becomes redundant, stilted, awkward, almost small-talky. Like, wow, thank you, Captain Obvious, for pointing out exactly what we can see right in front of us. Ah yes, I can clearly see that this door is made out of door. Hell, it can already come off that way even in the base product at times. Of course, you could always trim out dialogue like that when it's not needed, but then you might end up messing with the flow of a scene and inadvertently make it feel unnatural in a completely different way. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Additionally, some hardcore Big Finish fans may argue that not having visuals for audio drama is actually one of its biggest strengths. It gives you as many details as necessary to imagine the basic setup for a scene in your mind's eye, and lets your imagination do the rest, really allowing you to have your own unique personal experience with the medium. It's up to you exactly where the characters are standing in this environment, what distances they are from each other and in what postures, exactly how bright the lighting is, the amount of detail in the decor, whether or not you can see a boom mic falling into camera shot, so on and so forth. Therefore, animating a Big Finish story and putting a rigid, officially sanctioned on-screen interpretation for how it's supposedly meant to look with visual film language out into the world could prove disappointing, hell, even controversial, to those people who've grown attached to their own mental version of the story, and understandably so. And of course, there's another major factor here. Some stories in these audios are simply not meant to be visually depicted, as the medium informs how the plotting unfolds. Some plays have pivotal twists in them that only work because you cannot actually see these events. You rely purely on what you can hear alone, and thus come to conclusions based on that, but this can make you ever more prone to having the rug pulled from under you. Other audios are set in environments which actively play into the fact that you can't see anything, like taking place in total darkness, or complete blinding light, or in dimensions where the very sense of sight doesn't exist. Or perhaps the premise of the adventure itself is thematically and metatextually connected to the fact that you are listening and not seeing, and ergo giving such stories visuals would negate some of their appeal. Or maybe said premise is simply far too grandiose and expensive sounding to capture effectively in the kind of animation styles that we've had for the missing episodes, and attempting it without sufficient budget would only serve to weaken the entire experience. And full disclosure here, I am fully on board and understanding of these points, and if this discussion were about animating all of Big Finish ever, well, firstly, that would be impossible, there's like 50 million audios by now, but secondly, yeah, I do agree that it would detract from the appeal of a large number of adventures if done carelessly. However, that being said, some Big Finish stories don't have these elements, or at the very least don't possess them as prevalently. There are more than a few that are fairly conventionally delivered tales, which could honestly work just as well visually as they do on audio. Hell, some of them might even work better if the direction of the original product didn't translate well. And it's not like the animation would negate the original product. One could still opt to listen to the audio version if they'd prefer. And as I said earlier, not only are the animations very successful and most importantly profitable, but they serve as great marketing too. I say this anecdotally, of course, but 60s Who's popularity in general has seen a massive boost in recent years, and a lot of that is thanks to these projects. For many years, the Macra Terror was merely an obscure, half-forgotten footnote on the horizon of the show, show that only the most dedicated of hardcore nerds would explore due to the unconventional methods it took to experience it. Then the animation gave it the spotlight, and now not only does it get discussed about as freely as one might discuss any surviving Classic Who story, but it's had the side effect of making the era it's a part of more accessible as a whole. That's not to imply Big Finish is unpopular, of course, far from it, but imagine the additional surge of attention they'd get if one of their releases received a project like this. Another anecdotal point, of course, but even when Big Finish scores massive wins like getting David Tennant to play the 10th Doctor again, I've still witnessed initially curious and excited people immediately turn cold and lose interest when they discover that it's not in a visual medium, and that is quite a shame. Again, this is not me saying I think it's a good idea to animate every Big Finish story ever, and I totally understand that some mediums are just simply not for everyone. But perhaps animating a couple of plays to get the fence sitters hooked, kind of like a gateway drug. Assuming the rights aren't too complicated, I can see that happening. So now I've explored the pros and cons about this whole scenario, and established my case for giving it a shot, this of course brings us to the next, and arguably the biggest, question. Assuming that this can genuinely happen, and that all parties involved, from those funding all this, to the animation teams, to of course Big Finish themselves, would all be happy with this going ahead and taking everything we've discussed so far into account, which audio stories would be the best choices to animate? Well, it's entirely speculative, of course, and I could totally just end the video here with a big old shrug, but I do have some assertions that I'm pretty confident in voicing, so let's get into it. For one, I imagine that any plays up for consideration would be full cast productions featuring the genuine original actors from the TV show. So, you know, no partially narrated affairs like the Companion Chronicles, Early Adventures, Short Trips and whatnot, and nothing with impressionists covering for absent or dead lead actors. With all due respect to those creative choices and the people behind them, I imagine the motivation behind selecting a candidate for animation would be to have an experience as authentic and akin to the actual TV show as it's possible to get. So basically pretty much everything they've done with the first 3 Doctors would be off the table in these circumstances. Additionally, I think it would make sense that they would avoid box sets, spin-offs or long-running sagas and aim for more standalone outings, which negates a lot of their recent output. Apologies to the War and 9th Doctors. And lastly, this isn't really pivotal, but more what I think would be wise. But I like to think that they would hold off on selecting anything with their own original companions, just to avoid alienating potential newbies with an already existing character that they're unfamiliar with. Don't really want someone who's seen all of Classic Who jumping into their first ever Big Finish story with this hypothetical animation, seeing someone like Evelyn and going, "Who the hell is that?" With all that said, I'm now going to go through each Doctor that still qualifies with my proposed conditions, and highlight what I think are the likeliest or most beginner-friendly choices to be animated if this whole crazy idea were to happen. There was a part of me that was tempted to write off for in this analysis, since Tom Baker already has a ton of on-screen adventures and it's not like he's in desperate need of another one. But then again, he's the most popular and iconic classic Doctor. Oversaturation be damned, on a marketing level he's the best choice for selling units. There's no way in hell they wouldn't consider him in all this. Either way, in this scenario, I reckon that they'd choose an early 4DA entry like Energy of the Daleks. One of the appealing factors about the 4DAs from an animation perspective is that they are only around an hour in length, much shorter than your average missing story, meaning the animation team wouldn't have to stretch their budget as thinly across a longer running time. I can imagine either of the 2 prominent teams working on this one. If it were BBC Studios featuring Rob Ritchie, well, they've already had experience animating the 4th Doctor in Shada 2017, and given their work on the Power and Evil of the Daleks animations, this play would lend itself well to their expertise. Then again, Big Finish Creative have proven themselves capable of effectively animating geometric creatures in 2D, so they could do well too, lanky limbs be damned. It also goes without saying that a Dalek story would be a very good choice on a marketing level too. Energy of the Daleks itself is also fairly bog standard in terms of its story beats and presentation. I think the widest scope event depicted within its narrative is the protest scene in Trafalgar Square and the following arrests, and I dare say that wouldn't really be any more technically difficult than anything that's been depicted in the official missing episode animations. Additionally, the vast majority of other scenes are hosted within a limited number of interior locations like the Globesphere moon base, and ignoring the Robomen, the cast is pretty small, just the Doctor, Leela, and 4 other notable characters in supporting roles. I think one final aspect that makes this story the notable choice for me is that out of all the 4DAs, this one seems to be Big Finish's choice as the de facto representative for them all, given that this was the one that received a promotional vinyl release in 2018. I personally think it would be an alright choice. Energy of the Daleks isn't much to write home about, just your standard Dalek story really, but it gets the job done. Spare parts. Look, you were all expecting it, and I certainly wouldn't dare to disagree. If they were to animate any of Peter Davison's Big Finish plays, it would absolutely be spare parts, no doubt about it. It's arguably the defining audio not just of the 5th Doctor, but of their entire catalogue. A fact that Big Finish are aware of, as, again, it received a dedicated vinyl release in 2017, and the attention and excitement that a potential animated adaptation would receive would be immeasurable. And thankfully, it's one that I believe would translate relatively well to the screen too. I mean, there have been 2 separate television stories in the revival that drew significant inspiration from it. I think that speaks for itself. See, the good thing about animating a Cyberman story is that, well, Cybermen are uniform and appear virtually identical to each other, meaning the same assets can be shared across multiple figures and save some artistic budget. Sure, there are some explicitly less advanced conversion examples early on in the story, but I think the principle still applies for the most part. The cast of prominent supporting characters is fairly small, just Dr. Man Allen, Sister Man Constant, Thomas Dodd, Yvonne, her brother Frank, and her dad, and the rundown underground city location complete with curfews and patrols could be complemented extremely well with a dimly lit foreboding aesthetic, something that both major animation teams have shown they can depict well. I imagine the hardest part to visually realise would be the collapse of the city roof and the subsequent encroaching ice freeze, but I don't think that would necessarily be any harder to bring to life than anything that has actually been depicted in the official animation projects. And outside of that and the climax, most of the story consists of fairly contained conversation scenes between 2 or 3 characters, albeit with occasional moments of action sprinkled in. I will say that, in my humble opinion, I believe that the BBC Studios team would be a better fit for this project though, especially given its more standard length. But still, imagining this audio with a Macroterra styled animation? Me likey. Now, the 6th Doctor on Big Finish is widely celebrated, and there are many, many avenues one could take with a potential animated adaptation, and I considered a lot of them. I thought about Evelyn's debut story The Marion Conspiracy, or the 6E solo story Davros, or something with Perry like The Reaping, or even the play that serves as Mel's debut The Wrong Doctors, among many others. All of these have their pros, but ultimately with my final choice I wanted to take a different route and play it a little safer visually speaking. And bear with me on this one, as I do have an angle here. I would opt for The Trial of the Valeyard. Let's be brutally honest here, Sixie's very aesthetic would make him one of the more taxing Doctors to bring to life in an animated form. Even if they opted out of the rainbow coat and went for his blue coat costuming variant instead, that's still a lot of different patterns to consider, and therefore a lot of resources and budget eaten up by one costume. And that's before you even think about the complexities of drawing additional character models from different angles, or contemplate how the costume would appear under different lighting, or whether or not there are any outfit variations throughout the adventure that need to be accounted for, and so on. Therefore, to compensate for these potential difficulties, I wanted to opt for a play that is relatively light on the number of major characters, the amount of action, and the number of scene changes. And Trial of the Valeyard is tailor-made for this thought process, as it only has two locations, the courtroom from The Trial of a Time Lord, and the Mudball planetary satellite which hosts the story's climax. And aside from a collection of nameless background Time Lords and Chancellery guards, the only major characters here are the Doctor, the Inquisitor, and the Valeyard. That, and it being something of a sequel to The Trial of a Time Lord, the animation team therefore have a lot of source material to work from when creating scenery and character assets. That said, I did wonder whether this story was a wise choice narratively speaking, since it does require the Trial of a Time Lord as a prerequisite for viewing, and therefore might not be the most beginner-friendly for really casual Classic Who fans. But at the same time, it does provide something of a satisfying follow-up to the whole situation surrounding the Valeyard, and I think that in itself would justify an animated adaptation, and it certainly makes for a better finale than The Ultimate Foe. It's a solid play as well. I don't think you could go too wrong with this one. Anyways, onwards to 7. This one was actually kind of tricky. When first conceiving this video, I naively thought Master would be a great choice. It's the McCoy audio, no question about that. And in terms of animation compatibility, it's pretty much one location, 5 characters, minimal action. What are we waiting for? Fire up Adobe and let's do this, lads! But then I actually re-listened to it and, honestly, it's those limitations that might actually work against it. Episode 2 is basically a long, unbroken conversation between two characters, and unless you went for a really distinctive visual direction, I can imagine that coming off as a bit tedious in execution. And then part 4 takes quite the abstract turn, as 7th Doctor stories tend to do, really doubling down on ethereal flashback sequences and moments of trippy mental toying and the like, and yeah, I had to go back to the drawing board. Honestly, McCoy's Big Finish output in general gave me a really hard time because a lot of it is part of larger sagas like Hex or the Black and White TARDIS, and therefore aren't particularly beginner-friendly choices to go with. That said, however, there is one play with McCoy's Doctor that I think would work really well with animation. Colditz. While re-listening to it for this video, I could just imagine it alongside an immersive, darkly lit visual style, akin to that of the Macra Terror or the Evil of the Daleks animations, especially since the majority of the play's major story beats take place at night. It mostly takes place within the confines of Colditz Castle itself, with the exception of a minor excursion in a wooded area, and with the militaristic setting, a lot of the character costuming wouldn't be too varied. Another positive here is that, unlike most McCoy audios, there's nothing particularly avant-garde or trippy plot-wise that wouldn't translate well visually. It's pretty conventionally told, with a decent balance of action scenes and conversation pieces. Sure, there's the whole deal of Klein travelling back in time from an alternative history, but that's all delivered as backstory and thus doesn't really serve as a challenge to visually realise. In terms of appeal, it's an ace story that follows on from her development on television, and another significant pull marketing-wise, and this is something I'll elaborate on later, is David Tennant in a major role. He may not be the Doctor in this one, but come on, imagine Nazi David Tennant brought to life in animated form. Plus, people love the novelty of when Doctor actors play other characters, so it has that going for it. If you want to know more about Nazi David Tennant, David Not Tennant did a video on it about a billion years ago, I can't remember. And yes, there is the open ending with Klein's escape and Ace starting her McShane arc, but I don't think that particularly makes it inaccessible. Same deal as Spare Parts, I can imagine either major team working on this, but of course I think BBC Studios featuring Rob Ritchie just have that special touch. Honestly, I'd never actually rated Cold It's before, but re-listening to it for this video made me appreciate just how damn good it is, so I think it'd be a decent choice critically speaking too. So of all the Doctors who could potentially have an audio of theirs animated, I feel like Paul McGann would easily have the highest chance by a significant margin, considering the high demand for more on-screen 8th Doctor. Naturally, there's been rumblings of a return for him in the main show or a spin-off or whatever ever since 2013's Night of the Doctor. But to be honest, I feel like having one of his Big Finish plays transformed into an animation would be perfectly satisfactory and somewhat scratch that itch in that regard. Plus it means we'd have something better than that 2003 Sharda thing. But which play of his would I choose, I hear you ask? I'm sure others would suggest revered outings like The Chimes of Midnight or Blood of the Daleks, and as great as those stories are, I have another suggestion, and one that may seem a bit out of left field at first, but I believe it does make sense. An Earthly Child. For one, it's an hour long, on the shorter end for Big Finish, all things considered, and as I've said before, a shorter runtime means you don't have to stretch your budget as thinly, and that's certainly a good thing in this case. Oh, don't get me wrong, for the most part it consists of one-on-one conversation scenes, but there are a handful of crowded moments like when Susan makes her speeches to the Earth Council or when she's being hounded by journalists, not to mention a brief helicopter ride later on. Additionally, being set in a post-war 22nd century Earth, I imagine they'd have to bring something of a grungy rundown aesthetic to realise the mood of the tale effectively. That said, however, it's also by far one of the most beginner-friendly 8th Doctor audios, to the point where he doesn't even have a pre-established companion travelling with him here, so it's kind of a natural choice. And of course, there's the most significant pull of this particular play, the Doctor finally reuniting with his granddaughter Susan. Not only would animating this entry let the 8th Doctor have an on-screen event to his name in some fashion, after all, he may have the least amount of screen time, but he was the one who finally came back for his granddaughter, but it would also hopefully finally lay the idea of Susan's return to rest. Look, putting aside the fact that she already did come back, in terms of the revival, it's just never gonna happen. And even if it did, it would be too little too late and just overcomplicate things in regards to her absence during the whole Last of the Time Lords drama. The majority of fans eager for this reunion to play out regardless either don't know this audio exists, or they blatantly ignore it because it's non-visual and they want it to happen for reals. I therefore reckon that giving An Earthly Child an animated adaptation may hopefully solidify its status as the real deal in that regard, and give the lingering expectation of her return some closure. Honestly, I think it's a perfectly decent crack at the premise anyways. It may not be amazing, but it works, and again, I think it would work really well as an animated adaptation in its own right. So on to the 10th Doctor, and, well, an animation for a 10th Doctor audio speaks for itself. David Tennant is basically an institution in and of himself, and I can easily imagine one of his plays being selected purely on the basis of his own inherent fame. Plus, there's also a precedent for 10th Doctor cartoons, as we all know. Moreover, following his and Catherine Tate's return in the 60th anniversary specials, I imagine that any of the audio plays they did together would be of particular consideration. Really, any of them could work, but I'm gonna suggest Tech technophobia, purely because it's the first of them and honestly probably the easiest one to do. You wouldn't think that at first. After all, it does feature a city-wide catastrophe where everyone in London becomes terrified of technology, but it is worth noting that the majority of that happens off-screen, and for the scenes where we do witness wider carnage, well, again, the play is half as long as most of Big Finish's usual output, so that shorter runtime can hopefully free up a little budget for more technically challenging moments like that. Save for those and a little bit inside the TARDIS though, the adventure is mostly concentrated between the Technology Museum and the London Underground, making for a mostly contained outing despite the high stakes. And once again, the cast is limited. There are maybe 5 or 6 prominent characters excluding the Doctor and Donna. I'd actually be really interested to see what the cognoscenti would look like in motion. I think they'd benefit from visuals, as they kinda fall into the generic voice changer alien type as is. Again, critically speaking, as an actual story, it's fairly standard. It doesn't really compete with the majority of Series 4, but in terms of its viability for an animated adaptation, it could work. So yeah, that's my exploration of the hypothetical topic of Big Finish animations. Whether or not any of this is probable remains to be seen, and as I've mentioned, it's not something that they should go mad with. I wouldn't want to see the entire 8th Doctor range animated or anything drastic like that. But with wise selection in terms of which story they adapt, I think it could make for a decent experiment. Though of course, I'm interested to read what y'all think of this topic, and which audio stories you would suggest to be translated to an animated medium. So, comment below, I guess. Yeah, anyway, catch you later.
Thank you.